Join me, Mark Windows, for Windows on the World live every Sunday, 9 to 11 p.m. GMT. Check out our archive and program stream at windowsontheworld.net. Welcome to this special from windowsontheworld.net. I'm going to be talking to Stephen and Evan Strong, who are a father and son team of archaeologists and researchers from down under there in New South Wales. And I've done a lot of shows with Stephen and Evan. So if you're not familiar with them, go back in the archive. And you can also find their work at forgottenorigin.com. So I'm going to bring Stephen and Evan in straight away. Hi, very quick introduction there because most of my listeners out there are familiar with your work. And I've just given them the place to go if they're not familiar, which is forgottenorigin.com. Yes, Stephen and Evan have been working on researching a historical figure in Australia, which many people may not know of in the UK. And he was a researcher who was very convinced that there had been a previous global pictorial language of some sorts, which was very prevalent all around the world. So Stephen and Evan, could you introduce our listeners to Slater? Because you've done quite a lot more work on him, haven't you?
We have, yeah. We've chased him up a lot more, haven't we, Evan?
We have, yeah, to the point that our next book is going to be solely his work.
Well, we're going to do about 4 books on him because we've now stumbled onto all of his writings, which we thought were destroyed. And we've got a lot more information, and it's now become, well, it'll be 4 books at least. And we've got the first one done. It's about 35,000 words, and the ones that follow.
I've probably got 25 pages left.
Okay, 25 pages and it'll be out. So, Frederick Slater, a very unusual individual. I can tell you that he has been mercilessly attacked by mainstream archaeology today. They've claimed that he is a charlatan, a fake, a dreamer, a fictitious, made up stories. They've said horrible things about him. In fact, at one stage quite recently, Mark, they went and interviewed his family. And we've got a quote we're going to use in the book where they said, "We believe that anything that Frederick Slater wrote should not be taken seriously. It's all a load of rubbish." Now, the reason they've done this, Mark, is because his claims are so sensational that they have to attack. And I think you're probably used to this. When mainstream finds something really threatening and the information is solid, what they always do is attack the integrity and the honesty of the person delivering the message.
It's always an ad hominem attack. It's never about the information. Yeah.
Never about the information.
And then they ridicule the information and say, he probably thinks that Elvis lives on the dark side of the moon as well. All that usual stuff that we know and are very tired of and wish that they'd find some other way of attacking, because it's boring, isn't it, Stephen? Really? Yeah.
It is boring, and we've been copying it too, I can tell you. We're always been told about our motives, but they never talk about our content. Now, yeah. Slater's an interesting story because we've done a lot of research on him. And we were quite stunned, Mark, that what we found out about this man really did knock us around a fair bit. And I'd like to actually sort of take you through a bit of what he was like. Now, originally he was born in England and he came to Australia probably about the 1870s, I think, maybe 1887.
Something like that.
Yeah. And lo and behold, what he did, he then became the editor and main journalist for 5 different newspapers. And it started off on the east coast of Australia, up in Queensland. He was at Charters Towers, then he was in Gladstone. Then he moved down into New South Wales. I think he was in Mudgee, wasn't he, Evan?
Yep.
And then Newcastle, and then Sydney. He made his way through there. Now, what I can tell you about that is, in each of those postings, he was not just the journalist, he was also the editor of the newspapers. And on each occasion, as he made his way up the list, each newspaper became bigger than the one before. And by the time he got into Newcastle, which is the second biggest city in New South Wales, we've got his plaque, which is upstairs at the moment, that was given to him, a silver-plated plaque, which praised him for the fact that he had doubled the readership and that everyone working for him held him in the highest esteem. And then we found out not only did he do that, he'd been a writer of books. Sins of the Father was one, 4 editions of that. We also found out that he wrote songs for operas, didn't he?
Yep.
He wrote complete operas. And as the more you read about this guy, it became quite stunning. He was actually a multi-talented individual.
Yep.
And then we stumbled on something that really did shock us. He was also working with the Archbishop of Sydney. His name was Moran, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
But not only was he the Archbishop, he was the first Cardinal in Australia. Now, he worked with him because the Cardinal found some information about the fact that Australia was not discovered by Captain Cook in 1770, but was discovered by the Spanish, by a gentleman called De Quito, that had second in charge, a guy called Albert Torres, and Torres Strait is named after him.
So that's the strait between Papua New Guinea and Australia.
Yeah, he'd been there too, and he came here in 1606 and wrote this massive account of this place that he discovered that he said was larger than the whole of Europe and Asia Minor put together. Now, when you read that, you look in the Southern Hemisphere and you'll find there's only one place in the whole of the Pacific Ocean that fits that bill, and that's Australia. Now, what's really interesting was that the Cardinal put out this paper, and Slater wrote all the archaeology that went with that paper. That paper was picked up by the Mitchell Library in the 1930s and accredited. And to give you an idea how important this Cardinal was he was working with, when he died in 1911, the population of Sydney was 500,000 and 250,000 people went to that funeral. And I can tell you, Moran was using Slater. He went to see him in the 1890s. He went and saw him often. And when this Cardinal died, Slater picked up the baton and kept publishing more information about the Spanish. And he found quite a bit of archaeology, which he wrote about, that backed up the fact that he went to Gladstone. He was there. The description of the place that he went to matches Gladstone exactly. We have no doubt about that. And it became obvious to us that when Slater was working, this is where it gets fascinating. Most archaeologists, as you know, Mark, when they do work, they go on site. Not Slater. He sat in his, his study?
I'm assuming study or
Yep.
office, home office.
And what would happen is that people would go out and they were chartered accountants, doctors, landscape, what was other jobs? Architects, you name
School
it. They
principals.
they would go out into the country and they'd find all the information, do all the diagrams and give them to Slater, and they'd wait on his word, and then he'd make presentations to the Australian and New Zealand Congress. He made representations to the Sydney Anthropological Society. He was speaking everywhere, and we found literally hundreds of reports of Slater in all the newspapers up and down the coast. But lo and behold, the people involved said he's nothing. Now, what Slater also did, he worked with a gentleman by the name of Goddard, who is a quite important academic of Sydney Uni. And Goddard's great-grandmother was a lady called Eliza Hamilton Dunlop.
So she was the wife of the first magistrate
in the Wallamai, and this is in the 1820s. Now, don't forget, Philip turned up in 1788. They did not go into the Wallamai until they did. These were the first two people to go there. So we're getting people who are in there for the very first time. Now, Eliza Hamilton Dunlop, she loved the original people.
To the point where she wrote sonnets and songs.
Interpreted their songs and put it into English. When the Mole Creek Massacre took place and all the people who massacred them were released free, and the Sydney Morning Herald said it would be a greater crime to kill a dog than it would be to kill an original person, They were freed. It was Eliza Hamilton Dunlop that raised the concern, contacted the British, and they did another trial, and 4 of those guys that killed all those original people in massacre were then hung. She fought for them all the way through, and she was known as a keeper of Aboriginal songs, language, music, you name it. She was considered the expert in the 1820s and 1830s. And what she did was she won the trust of the chief of the Wallamai tribe. And he gave her a complete dictionary of the very first language that was spoken through the whole of Australia before all the other languages came into being. She claimed, and they claimed, that they all spoke one language, and a lot of elders still knew that language. And she went further and said this language was spoken throughout the globe.